So on this video, I'm going to talk through 40 tips that I gave away when I painted this scene to explain these 40 tips in detail. If you want to watch the beginner version where I go over the 5 essential tips really to get you started, that's on my website membership on the beginner section. So don't be afraid of greys, and to get the greys, you're mixing all your primary colours together, or more than one colour together. That as soon as you mix orange and blue, you're heading towards grey, and that's going to create natural looking colours, and it'll make your watercolours look more realistic. And I think bright, colourful watercolours can be nice, but too much colour everywhere can be not so good. So monitor and manage your paper's moisture levels. So important with watercolour. You need to know which areas are damp and which areas are dry, because that's going to give you your hard and soft edges. Obviously on this demo, I'm not actually doing a demo, I'm just painting listening to music. And check out the link in the description to my website, and also there's a link to the list of 40 tips we're going to go through here that I'm going to go through them quite quickly, because I'm going to try and keep up with me painting this painting where I'm just listening to music and painting really quickly. So I've got to be fast talking these tips, but the list is in the description if you want to print it off and look at it at your own pace as well. So I'm flying away here, so I haven't got to necessarily worry about areas drying out too quickly, because I'll be back into that wash before I know it. So, but as a beginner, you're probably going to need to monitor those areas and keep them moist with your water sprayer, etc. But as you get more confident, you'll fly through it. Use wet into wet gradients to create depth. I just went a little bit darker there in the foreground. I've gone darker in the top of the sky. That creates depth, but by doing it wet into wet, you don't get those unsightly hard lines that distract. So focusing on value and temperature, not color. So important. I'm not worrying about color at all in this painting here. I'm worrying about the tonal values. I've got it slightly darker at the bottom and slightly darker at the top. And color temperature, I've got it warmer in the foreground, cooler in the sky, and fairly warm in the rest of the painting. That's all I'm worrying about. I'm not worrying about color. If you worry about color, all you do is slow yourself down. And to paint loose watercolors like this, you've got to be quick. You'll see in the beginner demo, I paint much slower and more realistic to someone who's learning to paint watercolor will be able to achieve. But as confidence builds, you can paint much quicker. There is no race, but you need to be quick to get back into those areas. But if you're worrying about color, checking your color, is that the right color, it's just going to slow you down too much. Leave white paper and previous washes behind. So important for watercolors to keep them alive, that I've got some white paper showing there at the moment. I may well lose that during the painting, but if you can try to retain some white paper, it adds sparkle, or the previous washes. So the first wash of the warm yellow, say, leave some of that come through. It just adds sparkle, little gaps through the trees and things like that. Don't let mistakes break your flow. That's a big one, with watercolor. Every painting I do, I make a few mistakes along the way. I might get a bit of a run back here and there. I just keep painting. I'll either cover it later on, or it is what it is. And quite often it isn't actually a problem, that it can actually help the painting. I'm actually purposely causing run backs in the foreground there to create the illusion of texture and so on, and grass, etc. Number 7, match your brush moisture to your paper moisture. So that's one which comes with experience. It's very difficult to actually teach that. You can just feel it, basically, that how damp your paper is. Quite often when the sheen goes off the paper, that's a good time to go in to get those wet into wet shapes, but still retain the shape. If you've got damp paper and you put a too watery mix on, you're going to get a run back probably. But if your paint is fairly thick, you're not going to get a run back. But again, you'll learn that as you paint. You'll see this happens when you do this, and this happens when you do that, which is why with watercolors you need to do a lot of painting. Tip 8, use color temperature to create distance. So we kind of touched on that those warm reds in the foreground come forward, whereas the blues in the sky and that distant mountain, the blues recede. So that's kind of a rule for that, really. Tip 9, plan ahead for future layers. Yeah, when I painted the sky and then came down with that yellow, I painted the front of the building. So kind of think ahead that you generally paint light to dark in watercolor. So think about which areas you need to paint first. There's normally an order of things to be painted. Because I'm painting so quickly here, there's a lot of wet into wet. But because I'm aware of how thick the watercolor to water ratio on the brush is to how damp the paper is, I can still kind of get shapes when I'm painting wet into wet. Again, that just comes with experience. Tip 10, pivot and invent to cover mistakes. Again, mistakes can happen along the way. Think about, if you've dropped some paint on in the sky or something, could you bring a branch over or something to cover it rather than start scrubbing at it with a tissue, things like that. Connect your shapes. That's a big one for loose watercolors. Quite often I use dry brush to connect shapes up, but particularly your darks, it helps your eye to travel through the painting. Experiment and embrace anomalies. So yeah, things are going to happen with watercolor, and that's kind of how I learned the foreground texture there, that runbacks create unexpected things. Sometimes you want them, sometimes you don't, but here I've actually used them. So again, it's a good way of understanding the cause of the runbacks by trying to purposely make them happen. And experiment with brushes to find your core tools. So I use the Escoda Perla when a nice fine point. I like the Rosemary & Co. Sable Blends for carrying lots of water. I use the Pro Art Rigger for doing trees and dropping in the water and creating all those abstract marks. You don't need hundreds of brushes, 3, 4 brushes, and you'll find you use those, and those brushes inside and out. Like, if you don't use a huge palette of colors, you'll know those colors inside and out. And recognize the awkward stage and dry your paper. So it gets to a point where the paper's not damp and it's not dry. And that's what we call the awkward stage, is where you're likely to get runbacks. You start to lift almost dry paint off the paper and so on, and then you can't go back from that normally. So if in doubt, dry the paper and go again. But again, that just comes with experience. And have realistic expectations and be kind to yourself. Yeah, the artist's curse is there. We never like our own paintings. If you're a beginner, I couldn't have painted as I'm painting here when I was a beginner. Even probably 5, 6 years into painting, I still didn't have this level of confidence. It builds. So, be realistic to what you want to achieve, which is why obviously the beginner demo is there, and the slower version. So keep your hairdryer moving, that when you dry your paper, just move it over evenly, because you get dry spots otherwise, or wet spots, and then again that causes the runback, which you don't always want. So the runback is like a cauliflower in the paper there. So build colour harmony with a limited palette. I've mainly used the Pyrrole Orange and Cobalt Blue here, and some purples. The painting has colour harmony. I'm onto a winner already just by using those colours. That if you start throwing loads of greens in, and it's not gonna. You can obviously paint with green, but you wouldn't then necessarily be using lots of oranges. Pick a colour as an overall theme and go with that. Mix on the paper for wonderful watercolor effects. I'm about to do that on the roof here, that I throw some red on there, but I want it to be fairly cool on that side, but I'll put some blue over the top to cool it down and just let it mix on the paper. And you can get some quite interesting effects that way. Fresh paint on the palette. You can't get darks without fresh paint. If you're not a regular watercolor painter, you'll probably find your paints dry in your palette between sessions. That's going to cause you problems. So wet the paint up with a spray bottle, keep a damp tissue and close the lid on your palette, and just squeeze out some fresh paint, and use good quality paints that wet up well. To embrace abstraction over perfection. There's a lot of abstraction in this painting. Nothing is perfectly painted. Things like the windows, if you paint perfect square windows, they look awful. Each one is slightly different in shape. Same with the trees. Scrubbing with the side of the brush helps to create abstraction. And push your contrast for power and punch. We don't want weak watercolors. Go for again, that fresh paint, create those strong darks. Watercolors, because of the name, I suppose we probably could add too much water when we're painting as a beginner, and then that produces weak painting. So just remember, if you're adding more water to get more paint in your palette, you probably need to add more pigment as well to keep those richness of colours. So the bead, which we used in the sky, not so much on this demo because I was painting so quickly that I didn't necessarily need to rely on that so much. But if you're painting slower, like I did when I was beginning, that bead is essential. It keeps the wash alive and helps to use it as a locomotive to travel around shapes, cut out shapes, and so on. So that's a big one, that one. Use your fingers as painting tools. I quite often do that. I scratch out, I just scrub a tree off in the distance to get rid of those edges. Spray botter to re-wet areas safely. The brush will damage the paper, whereas if you just spray a bit of water on, if you want to keep an area damp, it's not going to damage the paper. So that's a great little tip, that one. Master the art of lifting paint off. That we can put paint on and we can take it off. So we can vary an area by lifting off paint and make it slightly more interesting. Connect your dark shapes to lead the eye. We kind of covered that really. Know when to scratch out versus lifting. Just scratch out in the dark areas. If you scratch out in the light area, it kind of just shows the damage in the paper. And break up solid lines, like the fence post. Don't have a solid line. Break it up. It just lets the viewers enter the painting easier. And protect your atmospheric background layers. If you've painted a beautiful mountain off in the distance there, don't cover it with the tree in the middle ground completely. Leave some of that to come through. And tip 30, there's a few of them. Use dry brush to create the illusion of detail. Just drag that brush across and you've painted 100 blades of grass, etc. Leverage complementary colours. Using that here, blue and orange. When they mix together, you get lovely greys and so on. Use linear elements to direct the eye. Those shadows lead us in. A road, a river, things like that. Use light glazes to steer your colours. I didn't need to do it on this one, but on the other demo, I did glaze over to add some warmth. Just bear in mind, a glaze, you're working on an area again in watercolour, and you will lose the freshness. So I try to avoid that if I can, but sometimes it's worth doing that. Sometimes I flip the paper upside down to direct the wash coming down. That with watercolour we generally paint on a 30-degree angle, so everything is coming down. So if I perhaps do a wash in the sky and warm it up, I might turn the paper upside down. Unleash some splatter. Let's be spontaneous with our watercolours. Throw a bit of water on here, there, see what happens. Throw some paint on. Just if you don't want splatter in the sky, just cover it with a piece of paper or your hand or something maybe. And use white gouache sparingly. I didn't need any white gouache in this one, but quite often I might just put a little highlight here and there, and that's fine. But just don't start painting with white gouache because it comes a gouache painting then. Watercolours, it's fine for just a little bit to save here and there. And don't just paint a picture, try and tell a story. I added some old farm machinery in this one, and so stick around and I'll give you a quick tour of my website. Those of you who've been thinking about joining me, that if you're an English speaker, you're best to join through my website rather than through YouTube. However, if English is not your first language, you can join the YouTube membership as they get the audio translations. So don't go anywhere. We'll peel this tape off and then I shall show you some of the website. And, it's kind of just made up, but it gives the viewer something to look at and try and work out what it is. That adding a figure, a bird or something helps to put life into your scene. And another big one, recognize when your painting is finished. You're enjoying painting, you just want to keep going. But I don't think I didn't overwork this one, but I think the previous one where I got all these tips in on the actual demo, I possibly overworked that, but I kind of knew that was happening because I was trying to put all of these techniques in one painting. Inject your life with landscapes with confident marks. So confidence builds. The more you paint, the more confident you're going to get. Start off with the beginner demos. Be realistic to what you're going to achieve, and any painting you paint, you're achieving something. You're getting there. You have to paint so many paintings to build that confidence. So every one you do is closer to it. So it's never a disaster. Just keep going. And then the last one, use a single splash of color. So on this scene here, I've got a lot of colour harmony, but I use that red on the old plough or whatever that is in the field to just inject some colour somewhere. Colour's great, but if you use it everywhere, it becomes a little bit over the top, but just a little dash here and there can really bring a painting to life. So there you go. That was the sort of 40 tips explained a bit further while you watch that fast-paced demo there. But as I say, I've got the beginner demo, which is slower paced, and I kind of cover 5 tips on that one, so that's more realistic for a beginner. And then the slightly slower demo where I go through each of one of these in more depth as I'm painting along. So hopefully you found that useful, and so this one was probably a bit fast and spontaneous, but that's how I would paint if I wasn't doing a demonstration. So it's probably interesting for you to see the difference, and you can see how quickly that was done. Watercolor is a fast medium, but you need the confidence to be able to paint fast. So don't feel you should be painting fast until you've built that confidence. But the best way to do that, to build the confidence, is to paint. So I was just painting that one way too quick. I didn't have time to get the 40 tips in during the actual painting, so that's why we had some of those other little clips at the end, a chance for me to show off my website where we've got membership that as a tier 1 member you can have access to our live streams, but as a tier 2 member you get everything, all the replays, all the reference images, and obviously the live stream. So that's the place to be. So hopefully you found that video useful. That was a lot to take in, I know, but like I said, I've got the beginner demo, which we just go over really the 5 essential ones, which will get you painting loose watercolors and all these other things that you build in time. So thanks for watching. Please hit that like and subscribe, and I shall see you on the next video.